"You're fired. Clean out your locker." The morning had begun like any other at Harbour Brew, the cozy coffee shop she'd managed for years, tucked away in a town just outside a naval base. It was more than just a cafe, it was a sanctuary. Olivia had seen veterans walk in, some carrying invisible wounds, seeking comfort in the familiar warmth of a cup of coffee and a place where they felt understood. It was why she had started the Veterans Coffee Hour every Wednesday morning, a simple idea that had grown into a cherished tradition. Ethan, one of the regulars, was a young veteran, no older than 30. When he first came through the door 2 years ago, he barely spoke. His German shepherd, Ranger, was always by his side, a silent protector, keeping him grounded. Olivia had watched as Ethan gradually went from standing in the corner, hands shaking, to sitting with the others. He slowly began engaging in quiet conversations about small victories and hard-fought battles. She knew Ranger wasn't just a dog. He was a lifeline. That morning, the cafe was filled with familiar faces. The rich scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. Warmth radiated from the people who had gathered to lean on each other. Then, a voice shattered the peace, cutting through like a knife. "Dogs aren't allowed in here. Health violation." Heads turned, and the room fell silent. Ethan's entire body stiffened as his hand gripped Ranger's harness tighter. Olivia knew the signs immediately. The quickened breath, the rigid posture. This was panic. She turned to the source of the voice, Roger Mills, the new health inspector. A man known for shutting down businesses on a whim. He was a stickler for rules and an even bigger fan of his own authority. He stood by the entrance, arms crossed, eyes already scanning the cafe like it was a battlefield he was about to conquer. "That's a service animal," Olivia said firmly, stepping forward. "Under federal AD law, service dogs are allowed." "In all public spaces," Roger snorted. "Law or not, I don't want to see dog hair in people's food. Either the mutt leaves or this place gets shut down." A tremor ran through Ethan's hands. Ranger leaned against his leg, studying him, grounding him. Olivia's jaw clenched. She'd seen this before with her father in the years after his last tour. The nightmares, the sudden panic, the moments when the world seemed to close in on him. She'd witnessed what happened when no one stood up for him. She wasn't about to let that happen again. Not here, not in her cafe. She didn't hesitate. "He has the right to be here. That's federal law. ADA regulations protect service animals." Roger smirked, arms still crossed, as if he had already decided he wouldn't lose this fight. "I don't care about your so-called rights. Here's my law. Either the dog leaves or this place gets shut down." Silence. A thick, suffocating kind of silence. The usual hum of the coffee shop, from the sound of the espresso machine steaming to quiet, conversations overlapping, was gone. No one moved, no one spoke. Eyes flickered between Olivia and Roger, then between Ethan and the door, waiting for someone to back down. Ethan's fingers twitched against Ranger's harness. The dog, sensing his distress, pressed in closer. A low whimper rumbled from Ranger's throat, not loud enough to be aggressive, just enough to remind his owner that he was there, that he was real. Olivia had seen it before. So many times in her father, in other veterans, in men who had witnessed things no one should have to see, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "My father was a Marine," she said, her voice steady, but with something dark beneath it. "I grew up knowing what veterans go through. I will not stand here and watch you treat them like they don't belong." Roger's lips curled into a smirk. "Then don't stand here." The words didn't fully register at first, but then a sharper voice sliced through the silence like a bullet. "Olivia, stop." She turned, but the moment she saw the look on her district manager's face, she already knew what was coming. Panic, fear, desperation. But not for Ethan, not for the veterans, but for the cafe, rather, for the business, for the bottom line. I can't do anything about this, he said, shaking his head. Roger has the authority. If we fight this, we'll be shut down. You're forcing my hand. He swallowed hard, jaw tightening, before he finally spoke the words. You're fired. A sharp inhale from someone in the cafe. A muttered curse from one of the veterans, but no one spoke up. No one stepped in. Olivia stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest, but her hands were steady as she reached for the strings of her apron and yanked it off. 6 years. 6 years of early mornings, remembering every regular's order, making sure this place felt like home. Gone in an instant. Overdoing the right thing. She turned to Ethan. His face was blank and unreadable, though she knew what was happening beneath the surface. The spiral, the doubt, the same thoughts her father used to have. Maybe I am a burden. Maybe people really don't care. No, she said firmly, but softly, looking directly at Ethan, ignoring Roger, ignoring the district manager, ignoring the suffocating silence pressing in from all corners of the cafe. This is not your fault. You belong here. You always will. Ethan blinked, swallowing hard. Ranger nudged his leg, as if to agree. Olivia turned, grabbed her bag from behind the counter, and walked toward the door. No one stopped her. She stepped outside into the crisp morning air, with the world continuing its course, unaware that hers had just shifted. She had no backup plan, no savings buffer. Rent was due next week, and she had just walked away from the only job she'd ever truly cared about. A lump formed in her throat, but she forced it down. Then, a low rumble in the distance followed by another, and another. The kind of sound that vibrated through the ground, the kind that made people look up. Engines, not one, not two, but dozens. She turned slowly, stepping forward until the parking lot came into full view, and then stopped. Breath caught. Lined up in perfect formation beside their vehicle stood the Marines, real, uniformed, and serious Marines. Leading them, walking straight toward the cafe door, was Colonel Nathan Pierce. Olivia sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The shock hadn't fully set in. Fired, just like that, for doing the right thing. 6 years of dedication, erased in an instant. The weight hadn't crushed her yet, but she could feel it creeping in, waiting to settle like a stone in her chest. She exhaled sharply, pressing her forehead against the steering wheel, her mind racing. What would Dad do? The thought hit her harder than expected. Her father had lived by a simple code. Always stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. But that was easier said than done when the cost was your entire livelihood. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat, snapping her from her thoughts. She glanced down at the unknown number. Step outside. We need to talk. Her stomach twisted. Before she could process it, a knock came at the window. She turned and froze. Standing outside, in the middle of the parking lot, were Marines, not one, not two, but at least 24 in full uniform, standing in formation, boots planted firmly on the asphalt. Leading them was Colonel Nathan Pierce. Her breath was caught. She recognized him immediately, a decorated officer, highly respected. A legend among those who served. He had been her father's commanding officer, one of the last people to speak with him before his final deployment. Her heart pounded as she fumbled with the door handle, stepping out slowly. The morning air suddenly felt too sharp, too heavy. Pierce walked toward her, his steps measured and his gaze unreadable. She forced herself to meet his eyes, though she had no idea what was happening. Without a word, he extended his hand. She hesitated for half a second before taking it. His grip was firm and solid, the kind of handshake that said, "Pay attention, this is important." He studied her for a long moment before speaking. "We've been looking for you." Her pulse skipped. Behind him, the other Marines stood motionless like statues. Pierce nodded toward the cafe. "Do you know what happens when you stand up? For the right people, She swallowed, unsure what to say. You find out who's willing to stand up for you. She barely had time to process his words before another voice called her name. She turned. Ethan stood near the cafe entrance, looking shaken, but different, stronger somehow. He wasn't hunched over, wasn't pulling his hoodie over his face, like he usually did when attention was on him. And he wasn't alone. More veterans had gathered behind him, men and women she had served coffee to for years. Some she barely knew, others she had watched slowly open up, just like Ethan had. Her throat tightened. "What is all this?" she finally asked. Pierce let out a quiet chuckle. Someone filmed what happened. A customer. It made its way to the base. Her stomach dropped. The entire base saw it. He nodded. And beyond that, it's viral, Carter. Thousands of people have shared it. The command saw it. The higher-ups saw it. He shot a glance toward the cafe, where the district manager and Roger stood, pale as ghosts. Some people are in serious trouble. She turned back to him, her mind spinning. "They fired me," she whispered, more to herself than to him. I don't have a job anymore." Pierce's expression didn't change. "Yes, you do," she frowned. "What?" "We've been looking for someone to head our Veterans Outreach program. Someone who understands both customer service and what it means to fight for what's right. We need someone to work directly with service members, helping them reintegrate into civilian life. Someone like you." The words hit her like a punch. A job. Not just any job, but the kind of job she never dared to dream of. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Pierce smiled slightly. "Take your time, Carter. But, just so you know." He turned slightly, motioning toward the group of veterans still standing near the cafe. "You already have an entire army behind you." The weight of those words settled deep in her chest, heavier than any fear she'd carried just moments ago. She looked at Ethan again, at the way he stood a little taller, and the way he nodded at her, silently telling her she had done the right thing. The right thing. And when you did the right thing, even when it cost you everything, sometimes the world had a way of giving back. Her fingers trembled slightly as she exhaled, her voice steadier than she expected when she finally spoke. "Where do I start?" The first day at the Veterans Outreach program felt like stepping onto a battlefield Olivia hadn't prepared for. The office was small, tucked inside the military base, but the stakes were enormous. This wasn't just about coffee and conversation anymore. It was about real change, about proving that she deserved to be here. She had spent years making Harbour Brew a sanctuary for veterans, but now she was expected to build something bigger, something permanent. A program that could bridge the gap between service members returning home and the civilian world they often struggled to re-enter. But not everyone believed in her. Who put the coffee lady in charge? She overheard the whispers before her first meeting even began. Some of the officers, the higher-ups who had spent decades in uniform, barely looked at her when they walked by. "She has no experience with military operations. This isn't a customer service job. She won't last a month." She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to keep moving, ignoring the dismissive glances and quiet chuckles behind her back. Fine, let them doubt her. She'd heard this before, the same tone her mother used when Olivia had chosen the coffee shop over a corporate career. The same looks people gave her when she spent more time listening to veterans than she did turning tables faster. They didn't know her, but they would. Olivia threw herself into the work. She met with veterans daily, listening to their struggles and frustrations. Some needed job training, some just needed someone to talk to, and others were like Ethan, who needed help finding a sense of normalcy again. She expanded the program beyond just counseling services. She connected with local businesses willing to hire veterans and brought in mental health professionals to provide free therapy sessions. But the biggest challenge? The service dogs. She saw it immediately, the way some officers looked at Ranger. And the other therapy dogs, the way rules and red tape kept blocking progress. Military bases aren't pet-friendly, one administrator had told her with a tight smile. They're not pets, she shot back. They're soldiers, and they deserve the same respect. It took weeks of pushing, endless paperwork, and one particularly heated argument with a general, but Olivia finally made it happen. A dedicated space on the base for veterans with service animals, a safe, quiet area where they could train, rest, and simply exist without judgment. The first time she walked into that space and saw Ethan sitting with Ranger, chatting with another veteran, she felt something shift inside her. This was working. 6 months passed in a blur of long nights, frustrating meetings, and small victories that felt enormous. Then came the real test, the Veterans Integration Conference, a chance to prove that the program mattered. The event was held in a massive hall packed with military officials, business owners, and veterans. Olivia had spent months preparing. For this, she had speakers lined up, statistics ready, and every detail locked in. But she wasn't the one people came to see. Ethan was. She still remembered the day she asked him to speak, how he immediately tensed, eyes darting to the exit like he was searching for a way out. I can't. His voice had been barely above a whisper. I don't do crowds. She had just nodded. I know. She didn't push him, but 2 days before the event, he came to her office. I'll do it. Now as he walked onto that stage, Olivia held her breath. The room went silent. Hundreds of eyes locked onto the young man who once couldn't even order a coffee without trembling. He gripped the microphone, took a breath, and then, "My name is Ethan Parker," he said, his voice strong. "I never thought I'd be standing here." The next 5 minutes changed everything. Ethan talked about his struggles, about how both the program and Olivia gave him back the piece of himself that he thought was gone. When he finished, his voice cracking slightly at the last words, the room erupted in applause. Olivia couldn't move for a second. She just watched as military officers, high-ranking officials, and business leaders all stood up, clapping. Ethan stepped back from the microphone, his hands shaking. Not from fear, but from something else. Pride. She wiped her eyes, exhaling a shaky breath. And when she looked around the room, when she saw the rows of men and women who had served, just like her father had, she saw him. Not physically, but in every veteran who had ever walked through her cafe doors, in every person who just needed someone to believe in them. Her father had always told her that doing the right thing isn't always easy. That day, she proved him right. And for the first time, she truly understood what he had meant. A year later, Olivia walked into a coffee shop just a few blocks from the base. It smelled familiar, the rich scent of freshly brewed espresso, the soft hum of conversation blending with the occasional clatter of cups. For a brief moment, it transported her back to Harbour Brew, back to the life she once had. But everything was different now. She wasn't the woman who had been fired for standing up for what was right. She wasn't just the former manager of a coffee shop. She was someone with a purpose, someone who had fought for change and won. The bell above the door jingled as she stepped inside, the warmth of the cafe wrapping around her like an old friend. She wasn't there for coffee, though she had a meeting. A business owner had reached out to her, requesting training on 8A compliance for service animals. It had become part of her work, now educating local businesses on the very thing that had once cost her a job. She scanned the room, looking for her contact when something caught her attention. A young barista, barely in his 20s, stood stiffly behind the counter, facing an older man in a faded military jacket. "I'm sorry, sir, but dogs aren't allowed inside," the barista said, his voice uncertain. "It's health code policy." The veteran's shoulders tensed, his golden retriever in a service vest sitting patiently beside him, sensing the change in energy. Olivia felt something tighten in her chest. The scene was painfully familiar. She didn't hesitate. She stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on the young barista's shoulder. "Let me explain something to you," she said, her voice calm but firm. The barista blinked at her, startled. She turned to the veteran and offered a warm smile. "Sir, you're welcome here, and so is your service dog." The veteran hesitated, then nodded slowly. Olivia glanced back at the barista, who was still frozen in place. "I know you're just following the rules you were given," she continued, "but federal law states that service animals are not pets. They're essential medical support. They're allowed in public places, including restaurants and cafes." The young man swallowed, looking uncertain. I didn't know that." "That's why I'm here," she smiled, "to make sure people do." The cafe owner, having overheard the exchange, stepped in with an apologetic nod. "We'll get that training set up right away, Miss Carter. I appreciate you stepping in." She nodded, glancing back at the veteran. "Can I get you a cup of coffee for a moment?" The man hesitated, then smiled. "That'd be great." As he found a seat, Olivia exhaled. She felt something settle inside her, full circle. Once she had been fired for standing up for a veteran and his service dog. Now she was the one ensuring it never happened again. Later that day, she returned to her office, her own office inside the Veterans Outreach headquarters. The walls were lined with photos of the program's success stories, veterans who had found jobs, families reunited, men and women who had rediscovered their purpose. But at the center of it all, hanging right behind her desk, was a single framed photograph of her father. Beneath it, a plaque read, "When you stand up for what's right, the right people will stand up for you." She smiled, finally understanding. The past year had been a whirlwind. The Veterans Outreach program had grown beyond anyone's expectations. Olivia had worked tirelessly, expanding resources, bringing in experts, and fighting for policy changes to better serve returning service members. More veterans have access to therapy now. More businesses were hiring them. And most importantly, there was a community one that no longer made them feel like they had to fight their battles alone. He thought about Ethan, how much it had changed for him too. 6 months ago, he stood on stage in front of hundreds of people, sharing his story for the first time. Now he was working as a mentor for other veterans struggling with PTSD, and Ranger was still by his side, but now, instead of guiding Ethan through panic attacks, the dog was there to help others find their way back too. It was a ripple effect. One act of courage had changed everything, and Olivia knew it wouldn't stop there. That night, as she locked up her office and stepped outside, she tilted her head back, staring at the sky. She had once thought losing her job at Harbour Brew was the worst thing that had ever happened to her. Now she realized it was the best thing that ever happened, because it had led her here, to something bigger, to something that mattered. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through the latest messages from business owners requesting training, to veterans thanking her for the program. She clicked on a new message from Ethan. "Got another veteran interested in the program. He's struggling, but I think we can help him. Let me know when you're free." She smiled, typing back quickly, "Always." Because this was where she was meant to be. In a world that often values silence over confrontation, standing up for what's right can feel like an uphill battle. Olivia's journey proves that courage isn't just about speaking up. It's about refusing to back down, even when the cost seems too high. How many times have we watched someone struggle, knowing we should help, but held back out of fear? Fear of consequences, fear of judgment, fear of losing something we've worked hard for. The truth is, the price of silence is often greater than the cost of doing what's right. Her story is a reminder that the smallest act of kindness, a moment of bravery, can change not just one life but many. What if she had chosen to stay quiet that day? What if she had let fear decide her fate? Instead, she trusted her values. And in the end, the right people stood up for her. Kindness always comes full circle. So I ask you, has there been a moment in your life when you took a stand for something that mattered? Or when someone stood up for you? Share your story in the comments. And if you believe that the world needs more voices that challenge injustice, more stories that inspire action, hit subscribe. Because here, we don't just tell stories, we create movements. Are you ready to be part of something bigger?